So let's read again. Chapter 23, verse 36. Behold, your house is forsaken and desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So this follows the woes in which Jesus pronounces condemnation upon the scribes and the Pharisees. And then when he says, behold, your house is forsaken and desolate, the house is the temple. And so he's pronouncing the temple to be forsaken and desolate. That really follows from his cleansing of the temple, which he did when he first entered Jerusalem, where he disrupted legitimate temple worship. He drove out the money changers who were necessary to change Roman money into Tyrian money, which didn't have a symbol of an eagle, which is an unclean bird. And so in doing that, he was performing a prophetic action, pronouncing the temple to be irrelevant. And then he says, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So I think it's from the 113th Psalm.
118th.
118th Psalm. Oh, very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So originally, the psalm is a psalm recited back and forth between pilgrims and priests in the temple. And so the pilgrim says, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and the priest responds. And so it's the pilgrim who's coming in the name of the Lord and is blessed, because the object of his, and this is particularly true for Jews in the diaspora, that the object of your longing, the temple, now appears before you and you're about to enter it, and that's an enormous blessing. The psalm also came to have messianic overtones, so that blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord is interpreted as being the Messiah. But here, this is really a mocking element. Jesus has turned the blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So remember, this is how Jesus was being greeted by the fellow pilgrims, particularly Galileans, as he was entering Jerusalem. And so now it's become an object of mockery. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord is sort of being used against those in Jerusalem and those around the temple, that there will be a sign of vindication, that Jesus will be vindicated. And then they'll know that blessed is he who came in the name of the Lord, but after the fact and too late. So with that, we can begin the Olivet Discourse. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly, I say to you, there will not be here one stone upon another. There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So that's a shocking prophecy. The temple is the center of Jewish worship. There is really no other. There are synagogues, but those really aren't a sort of part of Mosaic law. They don't have at all the same significance. This isn't synagogue. Judaism is still basically a century away. So Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. So they're presumably going toward the Mount of Olives, and there's a spectacular view of the temple from there. The temple was one of the wonders of the world. very, very awe-inspiring. And the disciples are struck with awe. But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here. I'm sorry, we read that already. Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age? So notice there are two questions there. When will this be? This being the no stone left unturned. And what will be the sign of your coming? And they use the word parousia, and of the close of the age. Parousia is the term used to applied to the arrival of a dignitary and the greeting accorded a dignitary. Our premillennial dispensationalist brethren believe that it applies to the rapture, but a parousia is not a secret event. A parousia is the greeting of the king or the dignitary when they come. So that's hardly secret. And if it were to be secret, and extended to the king, no doubt there would be heads rolling in the streets as a result, because the king, feels that he is worthy of more than silence. So, and Jesus answered them. So we have two questions. When will there be no stone left unturned? And when will you return? They're actually probably asking him about blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, but they're inadvertently asking a different question. And Jesus is going to answer the questions that they ask. So, take heed that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name. So we begin here with prophecy. We begin here with predictive prophecy. And if you, and a rather long prophetic passage, the predictive prophecy in both the New and the Old Testament is comparatively rare and very narrowly focused. So the virgin will conceive is a predictive prophecy. There are really just a handful. Most prophecies are typological, but this is clearly very predictive. So, and Jesus answered, I said that already. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the sufferings. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because wickedness is multiplied, most men's love will grow cold. But he who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let him who is in the field not turn back to get a coat. And alas, for those who are with child and for those who are nursing in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And And if those days had not been shortened, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. And then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Actually, a bad translation. Then all the tribes of the land will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Whereas in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they did not know until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two men, we read this last week, then two men will be in the field, one is taken and one is left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one is taken and one is left. Watch therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the householder had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have watched and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Let's stop there, since this is already a good deal to process. So obviously, besides refuting the rapture and the Bible verses that supposedly prove it, but don't, which we did for the last 2 weeks, it's better to attack with the counteroffensive, which is to present the correct teaching about Christian and Catholic eschatology. So what are the signs of the second coming? What signs can we look for that will tell us that the second coming is near?
None before, because it'll be just, well, the sound of the trumpet will mean it's arrived, but there won't be any warning.
Won't be any warning. Yeah.
That's very good. So then what is wars of rumors of war? What is the abomination of desolation? What is this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world? The desolating sacrilege, the famines and earthquakes, the kingdom against kingdom, nation will rise against nation, the false messiahs. What are all of those things?
People that believe in the rapture.
Ah,
That's a good one.
Well, it's what's been going on throughout the history. I mean, we're right in the middle of that in the Bible in a year, Second Kings and Second Chronicles and all that. I'm a day or so behind, but anyway, you know, that's been going on for forever. Kingdoms fighting each other, and people following God, and then the next generation doesn't and rebuilds, you know, their own temples with idols and all that. So it's really just it's what's been going on anyway. So people thought that,
It,
you know,
it partly is, but it isn't. Wars and rumors of war is particularly significant. So, in fact, as a general observation, it's true that there are always wars and rumors of war in our. Today, we can identify any number of wars and any number of rumors of war. And once those wars end and those rumors either turn into wars or they pass, then we'll be able to identify a whole new set of wars and rumors of war. But when was the world not supposed to be at war?
when Messiah came,
No,
it wasn't, okay.
during Pax Romana, the Roman peace that was established starting with the reign of Caesar Augustus and continued through Christ's day. So the point here, Jesus isn't really being, sort of generic. He's trying to point his disciples to a very real event. So everything starting from take heed that no one leads you astray, up to heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away, is a prophecy about the destruction of the temple. So notice he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. There are a variety of interpretations of that. One is that Jesus was mistaken. That's not an acceptable interpretation. Another is that a generation to God is, like 1,000 years or whatever, or 1,000 years is like one generation. This is in God's time. But then that transforms the entire Bible into a travesty, really a living joke. And whatever means whatever. Well, all we need to do when we look at any passage is interpret it in God's terms and render it meaningless that way, which is what this does. So the only argument that I think has any level of integrity or honesty is that Jesus is talking about the generation of people listening to him. And then when he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away, that's a Semitism. Heaven and earth will not pass away. So his words will not pass away in the same way that heaven and earth will not pass away. What he's saying is certain. You can be certain of it. So he's saying that with certainty, this generation will not pass away until all of the things he had said previously had taken place. So can anyone think of anything that resembles what he's talking about?
The temple being destroyed?
Temple being destroyed.
That was in 70 AD.
In 70 AD.
That was a long time ago.
So he says, verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. That has to be, and we can no doubt identify, what we think are greater tribulations. The tsunami comes along and takes away 250,000 people, the dropping of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an enormous crime against humanity, the murder of 6 million Jews and the Holocaust, the murder of an unknown number of Slavs, estimated at somewhere between 5 and 15 million in whatever it was called, German's Lebensraum. So I mean, we can, and assorted genocides everywhere. The genocide of Native Americans and in North America. We can, think of huge numbers of great tribulations that would seem to that would seem to overwhelm and make, the destruction of the temple minor. But that's not really the point. The point is that this is that Jesus is really focusing on its relationship to salvation history. And in fact, and so notice he says there has not been and will never be. So there cannot be anything as catastrophic from the viewpoint of salvation history as this event.
Well, and as far as the Jews are concerned, that was the center of their worship.
Right.
Was the temple.
It's the end of the temple system. It's the end of temple worship. It's the end of a significant portion of the Mosaic law. It's the end of the Aaronic priesthood. It's the end of a world. In the aftermath, we have this really a very painful evolution of rabbinic Judaism, and Judaism as predominantly an ethical system focused on the synagogue. But that was a very, very painful, gut-wrenching evolution. And so with the destruction of the temple, really, a world comes to an end. And a world comes to an end in a way that the world really, from the viewpoint of salvation history, can never again come to an end. I mean, one can argue it does at the second coming, but that's not really, the second coming is a hope rather than a condemnation. So I mentioned that predictive prophecy is very rare, and typological prophecy is much more common, especially in the New Testament. If we look at, for example, Matthew always talks about something was done so that scripture might be fulfilled. If we look at those and look at the Old Testament references he's drawing on, we see in almost all cases that those are typological. They're almost never predictive. So why is Jesus presenting an extended predictive prophecy? Does anyone have any idea?
For the sake of his disciples, to make sure that they realize that what he's saying, things will happen the way he says.
So the church is centered in Jerusalem. It's centered in Jerusalem still in 70.
Mm-hmm.
which means that, and also large parts of the church are still intertwined with Judaism and still intertwined with Temple Judaism. So if Jerusalem is overrun and if the temple is destroyed, then that's what's going to happen to the church.
Okay, so
Just everything would disappear. Everything would collapse.
okay, so I have a question in general about the temple. So I know there was a long time in history when God didn't make himself present, but they still believed that he was in the temple. So when they gathered for these feasts, they didn't have a sign, right? They didn't always have a sign. I mean, there wasn't a cloud.
Well,
So
I mean, the cloud was largely unique. The cloud was largely a character, accompanied the tabernacle,
right, okay, yeah,
and then also was present at the dedication of the temple, but wasn't necessarily always there.
always, okay,
I mean, the assumption was that God was always present in the temple,
Right.
although sometime right around the time of the Roman-Jewish War, Josephus records very disturbing signs of the one of the temple gates being opened, and the only explanation that he could really think of was that it was supernaturally opened, and voices were heard saying, you know, let's depart this place, and it was assumed that those were angelic voices. But I mean, there was a period in which there was no temple, from the Babylonian invasion to which destroyed the temple, to the restoration of the temple under Cyrus.
okay.
So there was no temple then, but there was a hope of return and a hope of a rebuilding of the temple, which did happen. But I mean, so for the Roman, so in 67, the Roman-Jewish War started. And so most of these signs that Jesus is talking about were present, especially the false messiahs and false prophets. You know, so the so there were a whole number of warring factions among the Jews in Jerusalem, and each of them necessarily believed that God was on their side. Each of them believed that God would protect them and God would save them. And they also, you know, they spent a great deal of time and energy attacking one another. And so the Romans laid siege to the city, and so Jerusalem was surrounded, and they proceeded to attack one another's water supplies and food supplies. Then the Romans did let people into the city. They wouldn't let anyone out, but people were allowed to go in, which puts pressure on food and water supplies in the city, which these people are busy destroying. So the end result was cannibalism. Very, very grim. So what he's really describing is in many ways early warnings, things to look for to know that something is going to happen. So in verse 8, he says, all this is but the beginning of the suffering. So you know that the suffering is beginning. Then there's going to be tribulation. There are going to be people who fall away. He says in verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So even many Catholics today interpret that as we're waiting for the gospel to be preached to the whole world, and then the end will come. But that's not what it says. So we always have to be careful about references to the whole world or to all whatever. So in any case, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world. There are three words in Greek for land or world. There's cosmos, which is a familiar word in English. It means the whole world. There's oikumene. Oikumene is a civilized world. And so both Roman and Greek cultures had this notion that they were civilized. They're the civilized world, and everyone outside of them is barbaric and doesn't count. So, you take no need of them, no note of them. It's like they kind of don't exist. So what Jesus, the word Matthew uses is oikumene, will be preached throughout the civilized world. And Paul said that the gospel of the kingdom was preached throughout the civilized world. So that part of the prophecy was realized in the lifetime of the disciples. It was realized in Paul's lifetime. So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, and let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Notice he's not saying let those who are in the world flee to the mountains. Let those who are wherever flee to the mountains. It's specific to Judea. And so what is the holy place?
Yeah.
The temple. So this is clearly, very clearly, a prophecy about the temple. So he's warning people to flee so that the church will not be destroyed. Because if people stay in Jerusalem, they will perish, and the church may well be destroyed. Also, kind of a dig, I think, at the rapturous. Jesus is talking about false messiahs, starting in verse 23. And then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together. So that for as the lightning comes from the east is a parenthetical, right? He's saying, people are saying, there he is, go out into the wilderness to find him, go into the inner room and look. And Jesus is saying that's the sure sign of a false Messiah, that the second coming, when it comes, will be very public. You don't have to go and look for it. You don't have to kind of wonder if it's happening. it's going to be very obvious. That's what he means by, for as the lightning comes from the east, shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered also. So if you want to look for a corpse, you just look at the bodies. And that's actually a return to his discussion. Wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered. The eagles are, an eagle is the emblem of the Roman army. So each what are they called? The group of 100 march under the emblem of an eagle. And so the eagles are gathered where the body is, which is Jerusalem. Then he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light. Stars will fall from heaven. Powers of heaven will be shaken. A lot of people, including Catholics, interpret that literally. There's going to be, cosmic phenomenon and whatever. But that's symbolic. It points to political and social and cultural upheaval. So the end of Temple Judaism, that's a huge political, social, cultural, and religious upheaval. It's earth-shattering. We've really lost a sense of how earth-shattering it was. But it is the end of the old covenant. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And here it is. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Oh, I was saying, right, so I didn't finish. A bad translation, then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. I'm sorry, this is a little bit disconnected. So I mentioned cosmos, right?
Yeah.
Mentioned oikumene. And then there's a third word, gay, G-H-E-E. It means the land. And most commonly means the land that God has promised the Israelites. So if we look at the book of Revelation, for example, we see all of this stuff about what's happening on the earth and, what's happening, wherever, everywhere. And it's a translation of the word gay. The book of Revelation, much of the book of Revelation, very much like the Olivet Discourse, is about the destruction of the temple. It's a historical prophecy that St. John received before the temple was destroyed. So what's mourning are the 12 tribes, not the tribes of the earth, the tribes of the land. The 12 tribes of Israel are mourning.
Not the earth.
Not the earth.
Okay.
We always have to be very careful about cosmos, oikumene, and gay. And unfortunately, people aren't. So then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Does anyone know what that is? It's a reference to the presentation of the Son of Man before the Ancient of Days in Daniel chapter 7. So let's take a look. Let's start at verse 9. The part we really want to focus on starts in 13, but a little bit of context would be good. As I looked, thrones were placed, and one that was Ancient of Days, which is to say God the Father, took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came forth from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because of the sound of the great words which the horn was speaking. The horn is Nero. As I looked, the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night clouds, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So the important point here is that the Son of Man is being presented before the Ancient of Days and is vindicated. So what Jesus is saying, so obviously the resurrection is a vindication, but the resurrection is really a private vindication. Nobody witnesses the resurrection. It's reported to some people, and some people see the resurrected Jesus, but that nevertheless is not, particularly, those aren't particularly public events. And given that they're really confined to a small group of disciples, they're outside of disciples, they're not going to be believable. What is vindication is the destruction of the temple. And then that's what Jesus is talking about here. Immediately after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened. There are these cosmic signs that indicate cataclysmic upheaval in the political, social, cultural, religious order. And then a sign of vindication. The Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. And remember, he's coming to the Ancient of Days. He's coming before God of the Father. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. That's the gathering of the church. This is really the beginning of the church age, from the separation of the church from Christianity, from Judaism. And so truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. And indeed, the generation did not pass away. If we take roughly 40 years as a generation, the generation did not pass away before those things took place. So that's the first half of the Olivet Discourse in sort of short order. Are there any questions? Are there thoughts? Are there comments? This was a lot of material to cover very quickly, and I did it somewhat disorganizedly.
I would like to ask you how can we know, I know that you have studied a lot the Bible, but how can we understand more when it's literal and when it's something that means a different thing, and you go back to another? I know that you know a lot, but how can my understanding, I can try to be a little bit more
Interpret on your own.
yeah.
I guess first of all, it's important to read in conjunction with like a good Bible commentary. So the
But you have access to words that are in Hebrew or in Latin or
yeah, but I think the basic secret, or it's not a secret, I mean, it requires, I mean, so we're not Protestants who believe that, you read the Bible and the meaning is obvious and the Holy Spirit gives you the interpretation and there you go. So reading the Bible always requires some study. So a good thing is to always read the Bible in conjunction with some commentary. So the one I most commonly use, and I don't remember what it was, it's actually a pre-Vatican commentary.
Hmm.
Then there's like a Jerome Bible commentary. There's a New Jerome Bible commentary. Those are also fairly good. Basically, sort of any Bible commentary is any Catholic Bible commentary is good. And then there's sort of a measure of common sense. I mean, so like given our faith, there are some verses that we know have to be taken literally, or faith makes no sense. So that when Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood," if we don't take that literally, in some sense literally, then really our understanding of the Eucharist goes out the window. And so with this generation will not pass away. The question is, what can that possibly mean if it doesn't mean this generation? we can play games with words and do the whole thing with a generation to God is whatever, however many thousands of years or whatever. But that's really playing games. I mean, the Bible is meant at some level to be read and understood and to have meaning. So when it says this generation, it presumably means this generation. And another common interpretation from our separated brethren is that it means the generation which is reading now, which is to say us. But that makes a mockery of everything, because that means that everybody else in the past who has read this generation had no way to understand what this generation meant, because this generation means this generation. That's patently ridiculous. So this generation has to mean this generation. I mean, there are just no two ways about it. If we try to turn it into something else, we become dishonest. So one of the things when reading and sort of thinking about how to think about something is, are we twisting things to accommodate it to our understanding? And then also, I mean, looking at St. Augustine's analysis of how we go about approaching Scripture, the fundamental starting point of any analysis is the author's intent. And so the question that we always want to ask is, what was the author trying to say? Is the author trying to say something here that's literal? Very frequently not. But sometimes here a literal understanding of a more or less literal understanding, although it's mixed with apocalyptic and Old Testament imagery, a more or less literal understanding of the Olivet Discourse is really important, because Jesus is trying to warn disciples that they have to get out of Jerusalem. And so that's Jesus' intent, that's Matthew's intent. But the starting point is always, what did the author intend? And then also in looking at scripture, it's really important, particularly in reading the Gospels, to try to see the continuity of what the Gospel writers are saying. So we often tend to see the Gospels as a collection of stories. So Jesus does this, and yay Jesus. Then Jesus goes on and does this. Go Jesus, what's next? And then Jesus does a third thing, and right on Jesus. And there, these three separate things that Jesus does. But that's not how it really is at all. The Gospel writers are weaving a narrative that has theological significance. There really aren't any or very few sharp transitions. There are very few disconnects. Things are closely related. Things are closely integrated. And so you always try to look for the signs of integration, and what is it that connects, two seemingly disparate stories or different stories. So that's, I don't know if that really helps very much to answer your question, Rosaria. But the most important, I think, starting point is just to have, read along with a good commentary.
Is something that if the Bible is the word of the Lord, and we read it, but we read it and understand it wrong, so maybe that's my understanding. So when I pray, maybe when God is giving me the answer, I don't know what he wants to tell me, because maybe I don't know know how to pray, maybe either. Sorry, I'm on level 0.
No.
I don't think so, Rosario.
I mean, when we believe we're being given guidance from God, whether it's in the form of scripture being kind of reinforced in us, or whether we think we hear the voice of God in prayer or whatever, I mean, it's always true that we have to be very, very careful. St. John the Cross addresses the issue of hearing the voice of God, and his guidance is that when you hear the voice of God, ignore it. It's a peculiar guidance from someone who clearly heard the voice of God and acted upon it. But one of so he argues that you can never really be sure whose voice it is. It can be your voice. It can be Satan's voice, or a voice of the demonic realm. And it can be your voice at a variety of levels, or it can be the voice of God. And there's no real, test to tell the difference. I mean, evangelicals will tell us that the test is whether it aligns with Scripture. But as St. John points out, Satan quotes Scripture, so that's not much of a test. I mean, he anticipated the argument. But in looking at his life, what is so he clearly heard the voice of God and acted out on it. But in looking at his life, I mean, there are two things that stand out. One is enormous humility. And two, he never said he heard the voice of God. So if he didn't hear the voice of God and everything backfired, it was his sole responsibility. If he did hear the voice of God and everything went well, he also took no credit, although he never said, God told me. So humility and caution.
I think though with like this course that we're taking, apologetics, I think you have to have some kind of an understanding of the whole Bible before you can actually argue it in defense of it.
No, it's a process. I mean, it's a we have to grow, and so you have to start somewhere, and you make mistakes, certainly. I mean, everybody makes mistakes, but I mean, you can't wait for perfection to begin because
No, but I mean, but
or you
so many interpretations, it's really hard to understand which are the better sources to consider.
well, then we also have the patristic tradition to fall back on, and admittedly, that's in many cases also very contradictory. Many of the fathers disagreed with one another very profoundly, and yet, at the same time, I mean, um, I mean, I, typically find, the particular fathers and their analysis particularly compelling, and typically, particularly, from my understanding, generally, correct. So, so for example, Saint Gregory of Nyssa is someone who, regardless of what he says, I always pay very, very careful attention to, and assume that he's correct, because I simply find him to be, incredibly powerful. His knowledge to be um, outstanding, and his insight to be outstanding, and his holiness to be outstanding. Saint Augustine is really, aside from, I mean, he sometimes tends to be too allegorical, and his doctrine of predestination is problematic and was never accepted by the church. But in most areas, he's really outstanding. People like Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, and the apostolic fathers like Saint Ignatius of Antioch or Saint Clement of Rome are really outstanding.
Who was it that Timothy was a student of?
Oh,
Saint
Timothy.
yeah.
well, yeah.
Timothy.
Well, there was Saint Augustine, but there was somebody else too.
Saint Augustine had heard Saint Ambrose.
Saint Ambrose was from, yeah.
There's also, are you thinking of Irenaeus and Polycarp and Saint John? So Saint Irenaeus is another real authority among the fathers. And so Saint Irenaeus was a disciple of Saint Polycarp, and Saint Polycarp was a disciple of Saint John. Does any of this help, Rosario? It's in some ways a hard question to answer. I think that the answer is to be humble, to take responsibility, and to continue to study and try to learn and grow. It's not, and especially to study. I mean, the in the pre-Reformation tradition, I think what's different, the notion of studying is very different than the evangelical one, where you open it up, the Bible, there God speaks to you, and now you have the interpretation. And as many people as there are that many interpretations, and then that's fundamentally flawed. So
Yes, thank you. I understand the, yeah. Thank you.
okay, good. So anything about the Olivet Discourse? So one of the things that this means is that so Jesus talks about the second coming starting in verse 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. So what he's saying is that there are no signs. When the second coming comes, it will come. There are no signs of the second coming. What we do know is that it will not be secret. Whereas the lightning shines from the east, comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. A very obvious event, but one without signs. Our separated brethren and even some Catholics are very fond of, kind of using predictive prophecy to match signs with events, which usually involves a certain strain because the signs are then sort of seen, a certain level of element of symbolism is involved here. And so, I mean, I don't remember exactly the for our premillennial dispensationalists, but the scorpions in the book of Revelation are like whatever kind of helicopters the Soviets had. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, those helicopters, sort of no longer were produced. So the symbolism has to change. I mean, the scorpion has to become something else because whatever kind of helicopter is no longer in existence. And so, we have this really idle, stupid speculation matching events to non-existent prophecy, which is just incredibly stupid. And we have a lot of effort spent deciding when the second coming is going to be coming, which is a waste of time. What we should do actually is next week we'll finish the Olivet Discourse and we'll look at the second part of it, so that we know what Jesus does say about the second coming. He does tell us to be prepared, and he also tells us what we need to do to be prepared. And what we need to do to be prepared has very little to do with letting Jesus into our heart. In fact, Jesus doesn't mention that. funny thing. He must have forgotten.
So when in the Bible said that the woman that has the oil for the lamp, so it is something related to that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a message. So, so he's saying that they needed to be prepared. They were going to a wedding. The 10 maidens. So that their role, presumably they're probably, um, friends of the bride. But in any case, their role is to meet the bridegroom as he's coming, and then escort him into the banquet hall. And so they don't know when he's coming. And, they have these lanterns with cloth. So you dip them in oil and you light them and they burn. And then the problem is that half of those maidens or virgins made a fixed assumption. They assumed that the bridegroom was going to be on time. And so, they had their fires going, and then there's a delay, and, your cloth is burned. So it's not, you can't really, and your oil is probably gone. So you can't really easily relight it. You need to have an extra supply. And so half did and half didn't. The half didn't, made some fixed assumptions that were bad assumptions. And it's kind of striking that fixed assumption was that the bridegroom would arrive at the time that they thought the bridegroom was supposed to arrive, right? In many ways, as many of us in the church are kind of in the same boat, that we assume that we know when Christ is coming. If we don't know, the hour or the day, we think it's soon, or we think it's going to be within our lifetime.
Well,
But
that's because of the rapture the whole rapture picture that we've been given.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean, Revelation is hard to read anyway because it's not literal.
Right. Revelation is deeply symbolic. And
So the bridegroom is really Christ coming,
right.
So
Right. And also apocalyptic books tend to be repetitive. I mean, so they look at a particular thing from a number of points of view. Our separated brethren look at them as sequential. So there are a series of judgments. They're the series of the same judgments from a different point of view. Our separated brethren look at them as separate judgments. And it just doesn't, it ignores the basic pattern of apocalyptic. It ignores the basic characteristic of the genre, which, it's like foolish. This was really a whirlwind tour. I think in Matthew's gospel, we spent like 4 weeks on chapter 24, if not 5 weeks. Actually, we spent like 4 or 5 weeks just up to verse 36, where he says, no one knows the day or the hour.
yeah.
So this was really a kind of whirlwind tour.
Yeah, it's hard to condense all that.
So hopefully everyone sort of got something from it. So next week we'll do the verse 36 through the end of chapter 25. So basically, where Jesus is talking about the second coming and telling parables of the kingdom of God that are related to the second coming. So we'll examine those. Hopefully we'll spend about an hour examining those, and then we'll do the reading from the end of Revelation and the new heaven and the new earth, actually starting with the second coming in the book of Revelation, or the point at which the church teaches that the second coming happens. Our separated brethren see the second, especially premillennial dispensationalists, see the second coming happening much earlier, because they think that Jesus is reigning for 1,000 years, literally, after the second coming, before he hands the kingdom over to God the Father, which makes no sense.